Hello and welcome to this video about primary source literacy, exploring key learning objectives surrounding the guidelines for primary source literacy by ACRL and RBMS-SAA. This presentation details the primary source literacy learning objectives as outlined in the guidelines for primary source literacy. The learning objectives include being able to conceptualize, find and access, read, understand, and summarize, interpret, analyze, and evaluate, and use and incorporate primary sources. Primary source literacy carries its own set of learning objectives, and primary source literacy generally is important because it reflects an individual's ability to conceptualize, find, analyze, and use primary sources in research. The objectives outlined here are not listed in any one particular order, as they do ultimately complement one another and do not necessarily follow a natural order of progression as skills are acquired. But an individual who is knowledgeable in primary source use can conceptualize, find and access, read, understand, and summarize, interpret, analyze, and evaluate, and use and incorporate. And each of these categories have additional specifications and considerations that are their own. Being able to conceptualize primary sources means that you can distinguish primary from secondary sources for a given research question. You can demonstrate an understanding of the interrelatedness of primary and secondary sources for research, and you can articulate what might serve as primary sources for a certain research project within the framework of an academic discipline or area of study. You can also draw on primary sources to be able to build and refine research questions, and understand that research is an iterative, ongoing process, and that as primary sources are found and analyzed, the research questions might also change as a result. Some questions to consider in this category are, when working with a research question, what criteria help you decide if a source is primary or secondary? In what ways might primary sources help you evaluate or challenge arguments made in secondary sources? And within your discipline or area of study, what types of materials are considered primary sources and why? What new questions might emerge after analyzing primary sources? And how might you approach the research process differently, knowing that questions evolve alongside sources? The next learning objective is being able to find and access. This means that you can identify the possible locations of primary sources and where they're available or housed. You can use appropriate, efficient, and effective search strategies to locate primary sources, and can be familiar with the most common ways primary sources are described, such as catalog records or finding aids. You can distinguish between catalogs, databases, and other online resources that contain information about sources versus those that contain digital versions, originals, or copies of the sources. You can also understand that historical records may never have existed, might not have survived, and may not be collected and/or even be publicly accessible. Existing records may have been shaped by the selectivity and mediation of individuals, such as collectors, archivists, librarians, donors, and publishers, potentially limiting the sources that are available to researchers. You can recognize and understand the policies and procedures that affect access to these sources, and that these differ across repositories, databases, and collections. Some questions to consider in this area are, what are the different places you might look for primary sources related to your work? Which search strategies or keywords might you use to locate primary sources? How might catalog records, archival finding aids, or metadata help you discover or understand your sources? And how can you tell whether a resource, for example a database or catalog, provides information about sources versus access to the sources themselves? And how do the roles of archivists, librarians, donors, or publishers shape what researchers can access? How do repository or database policies affect your ability to access certain materials? Next, we have read, understand, and summarize. And here you can examine a primary source which may require the ability to read a particular script, font, or language, to understand or operate a particular technology, or to comprehend vocabulary, syntax, and communication norms of the time period and the location in which the source was created. You can identify and communicate information found in primary sources, including summarizing the content of the source and identifying and reporting key components such as how it was created, by whom, when, and what it is. You can also understand that a primary source may exist in a variety of formats, including excerpts, transcriptions, and translations due to publication, copying, and other transformations. Some questions to consider here are, how might the historical context, meaning the time period, location, norms, influence your understanding of a source? What key details, for example, creator, date, place, purpose, are most important for understanding a source? And how might copying, editing, or translating a primary source affect how researchers interpret it? You can also interpret, analyze, and evaluate as a learning objective, meaning that you can assess the appropriateness of a primary source for meeting the goals of a specific research or creative project. You can critically evaluate the perspective of the creator of the primary source, including tone, subjectivity, and biases, and consider how these relate to the original purposes and audiences of the source. You can also situate a primary source in context by applying knowledge about the time and culture in which it was created, the author or creator, its format, genre, publication, history, etc., or related materials within the collection. As part of the analysis of available resources, you can also identify, interrogate, and consider the reasons for silences, gaps, contradictions, or evidence of power relationships in the documentary record and how they impact the research process. You can factor physical and material elements into the interpretation of primary sources, including the relationship between container, meaning binding media or different physical attributes, and informational content and the relationship of original sources to physical or digital copies of those sources. And you can demonstrate historical empathy, curiosity about the past, and appreciation for historical sources and historical actors. Some questions to consider here are, if a source is not a good fit, what kind of source might better serve your research? Who is the intended audience for a source, and how might that have shaped the creator's choices? How does the format, genre, or publication history influence your understanding of a source? How might issues of power, such as who could create, preserve, or share records, shape what you can and cannot know? What differences might you notice between an original physical source and a digital or transcribed version? And what does a source reveal about the people and experiences of the past? Our last learning objective here is to use and incorporate. This means that you can examine and synthesize a variety of sources in order to construct, support, and dispute a research argument. You can use primary sources in a manner that respects privacy rights and cultural contexts. You can cite primary sources in accordance with appropriate citation style guidelines or according to repository practice and preferences. You can also adhere to copyright and privacy laws when incorporating primary source information in a research or creative project. Here, some questions to consider are, how might synthesizing multiple primary sources change or refine an argument? Are there privacy concerns or cultural sensitivities that affect how you might present or interpret the material? How might proper citation contribute to the integrity and transparency of your research? And what copyright or permissions issues did you need to consider when using these sources? In conclusion, the primary source literacy learning objectives, as outlined in the guidelines for primary source literacy, all work together and are dependent upon one another. They refer to your ability to conceptualize, find and access, read, understand and summarize, interpret, analyze and evaluate, and use and incorporate.